Hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to introduce you to the next session about the future of virtual care and the regulatory implications. And today we have with us a great team of panelists, and I will start by introducing them. Let me start with Claudia Tucker. Claudia is the Vice President of Government Affairs at Teladoc Health. She is a nationally recognized policy expert on telemedicine. And prior to joining Teladoc, she was the regional director for America's health insurance plans, covering the Southeast. In this role, she worked with health plans and legislators. And from 2003 to 2012, she was the senior director of state government affairs and public policy for Medco Health Solutions. So it's a pleasure to have you with us, Claudia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Following Dr. Sneh Kemka, he's a very well-known figure in the world of healthcare. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Sneh with us today. He's trained as a cancer surgeon in Edinburgh and London before setting up his own digital healthcare business. And he has occupied roles as the global medical director for Bupa, as the Chief Operating Officer for Advanced Oncotherapy, which is a spin-off from CERN, and has been head of population health at Aetna CVS Health, the US healthcare giant. He is now the CEO of Simply Health, the 150-year-old company which is transforming healthcare in the UK. So thank you for joining us, Sneh. A pleasure to be back with you.
Carlos, thanks very much for having me.
And then finally, Robert Madeleine. Robert is the chairman of FIPRA International, where he brings to bear his direct professional experience in all things European Union, notably IT and life sciences, technology, research and innovation, health, trade and investment, food and drink. He, as he likes to say, he's a British by birth, but French by marriage. Robert was educated in England and is a graduate from both the University of Oxford and the French École Nationale d'Administration. Before joining FIPRA in 2016, Robert served over 35 years as a UK and then European Union public servant. He was a trade negotiator for over 20 years and a European Commission Director General for 12 years. He is the author of several books on innovation, and he's a honorary fellow of the Royal College of Physicians of London and a honorary doctor of the University of Edinburgh and an alumnus fellow of both the Oxford Department of Politics and International Relationships at the Cambridge Centre for Science and Policy. So thank you, Robert, for joining. Welcome, the three of you. We are grateful for your participation in this event. And let me start with the first question, which I hope it's going to be a very interesting discussion with all of you. So to start with, we all know that virtual care is transforming how healthcare is being delivered globally. And this has brought a lot of implications. From a regulatory point of view, which you believe, in your experience, have been the best practices around the world that are worth having as a reference, are worth leveraging globally and in other countries? So to start with your opinions, I'll start asking Robert. So please, Robert, what is your thoughts around leveraging those global?
Carlos, thank you. Thank you very much. And I think in this distinguished company, you're following what I think of as the Japanese culture. You start with the least expert first. What I observe in the telemedicine field in terms of good practice is reimbursement. And you can see very clearly across Europe that where there is reimbursement in the same way as for face-to-face health professional consultations, telemedicine can take off. And where there isn't, there's a problem. Many other issues are crucial as well, for example, cybersecurity, privacy assurances. But these are issues where telemedicine benefits, even in Europe, from a very strong framework. And that doesn't actually necessarily favor takeoff. What favors takeoff is when telemedicine is medicine and it's reimbursed and managed in the same way as what we used to think of as the standard approach of going to a doctor's surgery or to the hospital.
Thank you, Robert. And maybe I'll follow with Sneh.
Well, thanks, Carlos. I won't mention any specific governments, but I have seen quite a wide variety of practices. And so what I'd say is I'd split it up into three things. The first is around the infrastructure of regulation. So governments that are really succeeding in this space are those that are setting an agile agenda around regulation. Because telemedicine, virtual care, and all things digital are moving at such a fast pace, regulation is the laggard and it's the bit that's not able to keep up with the pace of change. So if you have an infrastructure of governance and regulation that will allow for constant and rapid cycles of adoption and rapid policy change, that is what encourages an innovative environment. So where that's happening, that is exciting. And I've seen a lot of that in Europe. The second thing that I'd say is you've got to get rid of these basic barriers. So in countries in the Middle East, we have witnessed voice over internet protocol being regulated against, or the use of video consultations being regulated against. Now, COVID threw that out of the door, luckily, but that sort of stuff was a real limiter to the adoption of telemedicine. And then third is the regulation of the doctors themselves and the provision of healthcare. So rather, like Robert said, the realization that actually healthcare, whether it's delivered virtually or in person, is healthcare, and that needs to be governed and regulated in the same way and the same quality standards applied. There wasn't that realization to begin with in the origins of virtual care a few years ago, but now that's come, and so those models are beginning to assure quality at the clinician level, which is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Sneh. And maybe followed with Claudia.
Thanks, Carlos. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, and I'm honored to share the experiences that I've had here in the United States with the forum. And so I'm going to approach this somewhat differently, and I will approach it as if I were talking to policymakers, whether it be here or whether it be in France. And so I think that you start with what is telemedicine, what is it, and how will we regulate it, and what do we hope that it does? And so we have established what I refer to as three basic tenets of good policy. The first is that technology can be used to establish that physician-patient relationship. Secondly is that the type of technology, whether it be audio or video or text, etc., it's secondary to ensuring that the standard of care can be met. And lastly, the standard of care must be the same for virtual care as it is for in-person care. So we don't want virtual care to be less than, but nor do we want to put barriers around it that make it unachievable and inaccessible. And so when we talk about technology, we can talk about audio, and because so many people here don't have access to broadband or access to high-speed internet, it is absolutely essential. Many people here are socioeconomically challenged, and so they don't have the ability to afford one of these like many of us do. Many people, especially our seniors, are not comfortable with technology, so being able to use a phone, whether it be their cell phone or their landline, is critical. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. And I think you three touch on very relevant topics. In a way, the government reaction to COVID and the acceleration of that use and certain normalization of the use of technology in healthcare. The challenges that we all see in terms of technology, but also how medicine is medicine, regardless of the channel. Now, since we finished with Claudia, I would love to hear your views on the next question, which is, well, we I think are learning globally on how to use technology in healthcare. The US has, I guess, some advantage in terms of time, and certainly there is a lot of things that we can learn from the US, but also from the European Union and maybe France specifically, or from Europe in general. There's also very interesting experiences. So I would ask you, what can we learn from the US? What would you say we can learn from the US? And that's for Claudia.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Carlos. I started working on this issue in the U.S. in 2014, so it's been a good 7 years now. 2014, telemedicine, virtual care was very, very new. There was a lot of skepticism around it. And if you look at the United States, we've got 50 different states here. You can equate those to 50 different countries. In the US, healthcare is regulated where the patient is at the time of the encounter. So we really have still 50 different approaches. So the challenge was to make sure that in all 50 states that we had a regulatory and a legislative environment where we could use telehealth to access the patients. And as we have gone through the pandemic, I would say that now's the time for action. We knew how vital telehealth was before the pandemic, and now it's absolutely critical. So what's possible in the short term in the EU? It may be that you work to change the site language to allow for a patient and a physician to be separated by distance. And that was one of the things that we did in the US. We identified the problem. We looked at all 50 states, did a review, and saw what needed to be changed, and then took a very systemic approach to that, and quite frankly, a regional approach. So we knew if we had one state that could get a very favorable environment for virtual care, that getting the state that adjoined it would also be much easier. And always when people ask me, well, what's the best way to go about this? You have to be strategic. You have to identify the problem. We worked with policy leaders to make sure that they understood the problem and the benefits that it would bring to their constituents. They need to be educated. They know a whole lot. They know a little bit about a whole lot of things, Carlos. And so we have to start with them from the bottom up and educate them on what virtual care is. My other suggestion would be think long term. Technology moves much faster than the legislative and the regulatory environment, so think long term. We know what technology looks like today. We won't know what it looks like 5 years from now. So anything that we can do to be expansive will be much appreciated and easier in the long run.
Thank you, Claudia. Very, very helpful. Thank you. And maybe I'll follow with Sneh. Dr. Sneh Kemka, he has both a very unique global experience and also the experience from the UK specifically, and also the US, given his experience with Aetna. So I would also like to hear your opinion, what we have to learn from the US, what we have to learn from Europe in general, or even globally.
So, Carlos, it's such a big question, and I could answer it in so many different ways. So let me just try and button down. So rather than talking about the regulation side of it, because I've seen some examples of very good and very bad, let's talk about adoption. And one of the biggest things that I learned from my experience in the US was around mental health and the adoption of mental health through virtual care. So during the pandemic, of course, there was a mental health crisis and lots of people were seeking better help. But the accessibility, the anonymity, and the group function that sits around mental health meant that it really did change. It had a paradigm shift. So we, when I was at CVS, we saw 3,000% increases in utilization in the mental health arena. And that was really facilitated by this idea of access to technology, but where something like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, I think is much better delivered in a digital than a physical environment, and especially where it is a group counseling, it is a community-based event where people are sharing experiences and sharing therapy. And I've seen that used really, really effectively in the United States. I haven't really seen that used effectively outside the United States. And whether that's a mentality, whether that's a commercial thing, whether that's a regulatory opening, I'm not quite sure what facilitated it. But I'd love to get under the cover of it and understand, because there is something that I see Europe really needing to adopt with great potential, which is yet unfulfilled, and which the States has done a very good job at.
Thank you. And that brings the next question, which thinking around telehealth, virtual care, being a right for the patients. You know, we, those that we are in healthcare, we believe that patients around the world should benefit from access to healthcare. Should be a patient's right. But still, as you all mentioned, there are some challenges. So we believe there is an opportunity for creating a global standard of virtual care. But what should be taken into consideration when we think about what's the right thing for patients? And you mentioned some IT challenges, for instance. But Claudia, when we think about the standards of care, what should we take into consideration in France, in Europe, in the US, globally?
Yeah, Carlos, if we go back to my original point that everything hinges on the standard of care for telehealth policy, and that's what a like physician would do under the same circumstances, then this approach is much more manageable. And I'm quite sure that France doesn't care so much about how the US structures our healthcare policy, but more about the strategies that can be used to get a solution that works for their country. So in 2014, in the US, many states did not allow for the patient and the physician to be separated by distance. And if they allowed it, then they were very, very prescriptive about the type of technology that had to be used. And quite frankly, they favored audio video. At the time, it was felt that if the physician could not touch the patient, the physician should at least be able to see the patient. That was in 2014, 7 years ago. Here we are in 2021, and in the US, all 50 states allow for virtual care and a technology-neutral approach. That means whatever patient choice, physician discretion, as long as the standard of care can be met. The EU has a great interest in interoperability and protection of healthcare data, and I really support them in that. These are also goals here in the US, and we've seen great progress in the protection of data and patient confidentiality. But despite the access concerns that we have, despite the technology concerns that we have, all of us want to make sure that the care being given is the best care possible and that we are protecting these patients' confidentiality and their data.
Thank you, Claudia. And I would turn the question to Robert. Robert, given your experience at the European level and your global experience with innovation in healthcare, what would you say? Are we in the right time to define a global standard for virtual care, or how could we do that?
So I think we're definitely at the right time if we're not overdue. I think that the danger is that if you give to decision makers a question that says, please define something, it can lose you another decade. And I very much relate to what Sneh was saying about let innovation loose. And I absolutely agree with Claudia's point that actually in Europe at the moment, we're not sufficiently pro-innovation. So I think there is a problem there. I do believe that launching a debate about a best practice community or a community of practice in telemedicine so that we are continuously spiraling up towards ever better standards, that would be the thing I would want to do. So the outcome is going to be a standard, maybe. It will necessarily evolve, but let's not wait while we draft the standard. Let's have a community of practice that creates the standard while also saving lives and improving well-being. I think that's a vision which would be consistent with, for example, the World Health Organization mission to find the platforms and frameworks that enable digital technology to spread more rapidly. So there is an opportunity there, but I wouldn't want to fall into the trap that we send it all off into a standard silo and then stop.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, let innovation loose. I think that's exactly what we all aim. And Sneh, since you also mentioned that term and your experience, and sometimes the frustration around the different practices of medicine around the world. So what would be your advice? How could we help in defining those standards of virtual care?
Yeah, so my approach on this is that, one, skepticism. So even if you take something really basic, like the World Health Organization's surgical safety checklist, which is that you do certain things before someone goes into surgery to make sure that they're not going to get a mistake made. You would think that the global adoption of that would be easy and rapid, but absolutely not. Getting healthcare organizations to adopt even the very basic standard is difficult. So one of the ways that I've approached this previously is through accreditation. So I used to sit on the board of the Joint Commission International, which is one of the sort of leading global accreditation authorities. And accreditation, the aspiration to be accredited and to get a gold seal of approval, is often a very big motivator. And so I would encourage the development of an accreditation system for telemedicine providers, which they would either be mandated at government level or aspire to at a global level. And that gold seal of approval then leads to better commercial return and stuff. But in that accreditation, it's not the actual process of the accreditation, it is the process of preparing for the accreditation, which introduces continuous quality improvement, monitoring and measuring cycles, KPI introduction, blah, 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 blah. And I found that to be a very effective mechanism. And Carlos, frankly, I think it's just a matter of time, maybe even peut-être c'est à Télédoc to make the global accreditation standard if you are really the industry-leading body in this field.
Absolutely, and you can be sure that we take you up on this one, as we are all working around, again, facilitating access to care to patients, and this is our mission. So maybe the next one, which is probably a very interesting one, very open question around, well, lots of people are asking, many of these challenges have been lifted through the pandemic, but will things go back to where they were, or we will take advantage of these opportunities? So how do you think virtual care is going to evolve over the next 5 years from a regulatory perspective? And if you can give any examples. So starting with Sneh, maybe?
Well, one thing I know is that it's here to stay. And so, Carlos, you and I have lived through this as we spun up services together for various parts of the world. It is definitely here to stay. And I'd say one of the biggest humps that we've come over is clinician adoption of telemedicine. So when you look at the average mom and pop primary care practitioner, the reluctance and the lack of acceptance of moving into a telemedicine platform was blown away by COVID. And so digital adoption in the most laggard of communities, which is often the clinician community, suddenly went through the roof. And so I think once you've got that clinician and professional buy-in to telemedicine, and you've got a commercial model that works with clinicians whereby they can monetize the use of telemedicine, that changes the game significantly, because they're the ones who essentially drive the regulation and the governance models that sit behind it. And if you get mass adoption amongst clinicians, that is going to shift the needle quite considerably. And I think that's one of the biggest things that are coming out of the pandemic in terms of telemedicine adoption regulation.
Absolutely. Clinician adoption drives changes in a way. So Claudia, what is your view? What's going to happen in the next 5 years? Maybe a US view on regulatory expectations in terms of change.
I see the future is very bright, but now is certainly not the time to take our foot off the gas. Just a few years ago, virtual care was for general medical, non-emergent illnesses. And now the future is using virtual care for things like chronic disease, emergency care, and global access. Now that we have the technology and the regulatory environment, we need to look at things like payment and reimbursement reform and matching resources with consumer demand. And I always caution people that we have got to make sure that we keep quality and clinical superiority at the forefront. Everything has got to be done to the highest quality that we possibly can. And I encourage people to talk to the people who oppose virtual care, who still don't understand it and think it's secondary care, and not just the ones who support it, because they're the easy people for us to talk to. We need to bring data to the table. Our opponents may bring sad stories, but we need to bring numbers, compelling arguments, logic, and research. We need to make sure that we keep our strategy that's based upon outcomes, and just again make sure that we hammer home the clinical accessibility for people all over the world.
Thank you, Claudia. And maybe, Robert, given that you have set some regulations in the past, so what's your expectations in terms of what is going to change in the next 5 years?
So I think the main thing that will change, and Sneh has said it, is that having realized what we can do in the COVID era, maybe the threshold for adoption is reduced in many medical communities around Europe. But I say maybe because, you know, human nature being what it is, once we're through the crisis, we may forget what we learned. I think this is a big risk. So I think the reminding people of how easy it was, and maybe increasing the effort to put advice and examples within the reach of clinical leaders in every specialty in most leading hospitals. I think it's that sort of exercise that will work very well. And that's where I think health organizations such as the WHO, national systems across Europe, as well as providers such as Teladoc can cooperate. And then we need to do more to get the news out about the successes. I mean, that's really important because the speed of learning, and again, Sneh said it very well, can be slow. I mean, I remember going to the 10th birthday party of the eHealth group of the Royal College of Physicians in London. They said, you know, after 10 years, we still haven't got most physicians to turn the screen with the data so that the patient can see it. This was during a face-to-face consultation, of course. And so we have to do better than that in the next 5 years. But I think scaling means finding examples that we can quote loudly in every region across Europe, and there are 250 regions. They all have regional hospitals with cutting-edge teams, but some of them begin to see this can be a thing, but they still don't quite know how to do it. So can we go to those people and say, here's a plug-and-play solution, test it, here's a free trial? I think we need to do human marketing, I think, and then takeoff can scale. As takeoff scales, what I actually then think will be the next thing that begins is we'll realize how wonderful this is in the health data space age. Europe, I mean, some countries faster than others, France would be one that's doing really well, are building their health data hubs. Once you've got that connected, not just to primary and hospital healthcare, but also to remote patient monitoring, then you're really able to scale a lot, as long as you can manage anonymization, necessity of secondary use. And so I think those would be the two things. Firstly, getting that word of mouth out there, and secondly, showing how this further catalyzes the ongoing health data revolution.
Great, thank you, Robert. And maybe following to this, and this is the last question I will make, which is around the transformation, the digital transformation. In our audience, we have from hospital managers, medical centers, pharmacy chains, insurance companies from France and also from abroad. What would you suggest to them in terms of what should be our priorities when we look about investment in healthcare, specifically on how to provide better access to our patients? What would be the biggest mistakes that you've seen, and what should we do and focus in terms of resources and investments going forward? And maybe start with Sneh.
There we go. So it's a great question. I won't talk about mistakes. I'll talk about the way forward and where I think is going to be very important. So I started adopting a mantra around healthcare, which is digital where possible, physical where necessary. So let's not forget that there is the physical componentry, and that is not going to go away. Sometimes it's the touch of the doctor, sometimes it's the taking of the bloods, sometimes it's the insertion of the proctoscope. But there is obviously the physical componentry that's required. But digital where possible, and investment in digital where possible, is fundamentally important. And I'll just focus on one thing, which is the management of chronic disease. So we know just how much of the health ecosystem and economics chronic disease eats up, and how poor a model it is for the consumer. So related to Robert's last point, with the advent of remote patient monitoring, where I am getting a much better continuous glucose read on my 75-year-old patient who doesn't want to note it down in a little yellow book and trot down to the GPs every 3 months to get their insulin modulated, telemedicine virtual care provides just a much better solution from both the provider and from the patient angle, as well as decreasing cost and improving outcome. And if we don't invest in that area, we as a healthcare community are really missing a fundamental trick. This is where the real beauty of it lies. So episodic consultation for primary care conditions is one part of it, but the maintenance of long-term health conditions through a telemedical RPM IoT set of modalities and an offline clinic setting is actually the way of the future. And that's where I'm investing my money.
Thank you, Sneh. And maybe followed by Claudia, what would you think in terms of our focus and investment in this field?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we should not be narrowly focused. We've talked about how far telehealth should come. And quite frankly, you know, we haven't even touched the outer limits of where it can take us. So don't be narrowly focused. I encourage all policymakers to make sure that they're educating the patients on telemedicine so that they're not afraid of it, they actually embrace it. And of course, our hospitals and our physician systems make sure that they are properly leveraged and they've got the money to invest in infrastructure that's needed in order to be able to see their patients virtually. And that's not just in the large cities, it's also in the rural areas of the world. Telehealth is the great social equalizer. It allows a person in rural America to be able to see the best physicians in the world, which may be in France. Regardless of socioeconomic diversities, it really is the one that kind of levels the playing field for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, it is a great social equalizer. This is something that we have been saying previous to the pandemic. Maybe the last question or the last remark to Robert, which I would think around the area of governments. What should the governments focusing? We are now seeing the European funds for reconstruction, for instance, and there are some of them devoted to healthcare. What should we focus those investments and resources to in order to really have a transformational impact on healthcare?
My honest opinion is that we need what in agriculture policy in both Europe and the US we used to call extension schemes. We need pump priming, which both puts knowledge into the minds of potential users, shows them the way, reduces the threshold costs both of learning and of deploying. So I think that there is scope to link up this huge pot of money for recovery and the huge opportunity of telehealth. Digital is one of the key sub-goals of the Recovering Better strategy. So in Europe, I think that's a huge opportunity. Equally, health research and innovation, the new funding, which is just being launched now as we speak for the next 7 years, the health component is big. For obvious current reasons, the infectious disease component is big, but the digital health piece is there as well. And I think there is scope to really to convene the people who are beginning to think about how shall I deploy that effort in research and innovation. And it's more innovation than research. But if there's a research piece there, I think it's the user experience, the human interface, the trust aspects. I think there is a piece of, in a way, digital humanities work, which should be done alongside deployment in order to remove some of the ignorance and, yes, probably stigma that still attaches to all this novel stuff.
Well, thank you so much. And with that, we will conclude the session of today. I just want to thank the three of you, Claudia, Sneh, Robert, for your great participation in this event. And I look forward to continue conversation afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Thanks, everyone.
My name is Laura Poncela. I joined Teladoc 8 months ago, coming from life science sector and very well-regulated sectors like pharma and medical devices, and well-regulated not meaning well in the sense of good. We can discuss that. It's not the purpose of this presentation, but indeed well-regulated because they are legally externally regulated, but is that provoking and which well systems to healthcare. That is not the purpose of this presentation, but in healthcare services column, how do there are that's enough to treat patients, but there are maybe want to say what are we seeing over My name is Laura Poncela. I joined Teladoc 8 months ago, coming from life science sector and very well-regulated sectors like pharma and medical devices, and well-regulated not meaning well in the sense of good. We can discuss that. It's not the purpose of this presentation, but indeed well-regulated because they are legally externally regulated, but as well there are a lot of self-assessment rules from the industry itself as well, and it seems that in general terms there's quite a high level of harmonization across the different countries or regions is mainly speaking or tackling about European Union as a fact. However, whenever we enter into the part of healthcare services, what really amazed me is that although being very regulated from a legal perspective, and indeed we could say, although the life science sector started with doctors, physicians, healthcare professionals rendering their activity, what amazed me is that they are not so harmonized across different jurisdictions. Indeed, we might see a few cases today where even countries do not have the rendering of healthcare services harmonized. And second as well, that amazed me quite a lot. And second as well, what we would see is that indeed certain approaches are pretty different in between them. But let's start the presentation, and let's as well have in mind that what we are going to talk about e-health is not really new. Has already been a few years that it's in the market, maybe not so well known or advertised in certain jurisdictions already, with pieces of legislation of more than 10 years, like in France. But as said, sometimes tackle in an insecure manner because they do not know how to legislate on e-health. And second as well, what we have seen is that although it was there, COVID has said to provoke e-health, and that's not really correct. I think, and this I'm already doing a little bit of a spoiler of one of the conclusions, COVID has not provoked e-health at all. COVID has indeed evidence that e-health was there, reliable, and really needs to stay. However, let's discuss a little bit how it's going to stay. So I'm gonna go through my presentation, first of all, trying to clarify concepts. We cannot harmonize the legal landscape if first we do not clarify concepts. And whenever speaking about concepts, we will see that e-health, it's a kind of a very broad and general term. However, we would like, for the purpose of these presentations, mainly focus on telemedicine, that is to say, healthcare services. Then whenever we will go through telemedicine, we will see a few examples about the current legal framework across that are going to show how different approach different legislators have taken. And we are going to try to understand the why of these differences. But we need to be clear at the same time that there has been already evidence about the benefits of e-health. So maybe understanding, and this is going to be the third bucket of this presentation, maybe understanding which are the concerns, we can address them. And we can address them in different ways. Maybe there's nothing to be done. Maybe the concern can be addressed just by saying, telemedicine is here. Telemedicine is another way of rendering healthcare services. And finally, we would like to share with you certain conclusions and outcomes of this presentation that Teletalk is understanding that might require a broad action and as well as strong action in this regard. So let's start. Let's start first clarifying concepts, clarifying e-health. As e-health has been used in different ways. Sometimes the term telemedicine has been used to substitute e-health. Sometimes technology applicable to the healthcare service sector is considered to be health, etc. But we like to distinguish three different buckets. First, the first one, it's what we call med technology. E-health, one of the pieces of e-health or one of the buckets is the technology. And whenever we're speaking about technology, we are speaking in a broad way. Technology that can be medical devices, apps, softwares that are applied when rendering healthcare services, can be robots as well. Why not? Can be as well systems, technology systems that allow healthcare professionals or healthcare organizations to, for instance, store the medical records, what we call e-medical records. As well, med technology is imaging and sending imaging through safe means from one side to another one without the need of taking physical assets and avoiding this patient taking from here the images and then taking them to the specialist or to the doctor. And then as well, let's include as well what in France is known as telesurveillance médicale. That is to say, the monitoring as well. There's a lot of technology systems that allow for telesurveillance médicale that will help a lot on a daily basis without a specific need of a healthcare professional or healthcare organization to contact the patient, but just these patients, for instance, wearing this watch that is controlling, for instance, the heart beating, and in case the heart beating starts going very, very fast, then an alert shows up. So the first bucket of e-health is med technology. The second bucket is what we call interaction or communication in between healthcare professionals. I'm sorry. We lawyers, sometimes we need to use acronyms. HCP refers to healthcare professionals. So sometimes it's healthcare professionals to other healthcare professionals or to specialists. That would be actions as tele-expertise, tele-assistance médicale, for instance. That would be, for instance, as we might see in the photo, having an emergency situation at a hospital with a small baby just born and then connecting to the specialist, to the pediatrician specialist. So with a very good defined imaging and connection, these specialists can help the HCP, the doctor that is in front of the patient, in the whole process of treating the small patient. And the third bucket is rendering directly to the patient a medical act. What it's being called sometimes telemedicine, sometimes teleconsultation, and in many jurisdictions, once again, we are seeing that is being used indistinctively. Although medically and legally speaking, there is a difference, a huge difference indeed, in between telemedicine and teleconsultation. And this example indeed is going to help me to continue with the next slide. One point, whenever we are speaking about e-health, it's practicing healthcare services through or with the support of information and communication technologies that, and this action might be real time with the physician to physician, physician to patient, or it might be delayed in time, that is to say emailing, that is to say chatbot, that is to say, for instance, as well, messaging. So let's move forward about, and starting with the landscapes overview. And this will help us as well to distinguish in between the terms telemedicine and teleconsultation that so often are used as synonymous. So here, for instance, we can see some territories, in some cases are countries, in some cases are regions within the countries, but we can see, for instance, the different approach that they have concerning telemedicine. So we can see in the first column what this study tries to do. By the way, this study, we have the footnote clarifying that this study was performed by the organization Europe Economics in the UK. They do regularly update this report, which is really good because shows the different legislative tendencies across the globe. So in this study, they analyze by making surveys and questions to different healthcare authorities across the globe. They analyze how they approach telemedicine. And for instance, we can see in the first column, how do they tackle telemedicine? Do they ask something totally different, new, or specificities because different telemedicine to a face-to-face act? So here we are starting to see that there are a couple of regions within Canada that they have different approach amongst them. But as well, we have Australia, that for certain things, it's Australia, New Zealand, that indeed in between both regions, they also tackle that differently. What this first column tries to say is in which countries the same standard of face-to-face healthcare applies to telemedicine. So we just see that we start to have differences there. Then the second column, what tries to reflect is whether they feel that there's a need for an extra, in the case of telemedicine, that a face-to-face act might not allow. And here, there as well, we are starting as well to see differences. And indeed, it seems that certain regions in Canada and the US are more reluctant to as well to consider that telemedicine might provide all. The third column considers or tackles the appropriateness of telemedicine. And here what we do see is that there is a recognition in many jurisdictions that telemedicine is capable to cope medical acts. However, there might be other places where specifically they will regulate that for this and that. Is not telemedicine is not appropriate. What does it mean is that cannot be used for certain purposes. For example, in certain jurisdictions, we might see that telemedicine is not enough for rendering medical acts. And this leads to the fourth column. The fourth column, indeed, is the one that is going to help us to understand the difference in between telemedicine and teleconsultation. So the fourth column establishes whether there is a need to have a face-to-face meeting before the physician can move forward with a remote technology to connect with the patient. What is to say, there needs to be a face-to-face meeting at the beginning of the relationship. There needs to be face-to-face meeting on a regular basis, sometimes each 12 months. Or in case there is a need, for instance, to do a referral or to do a prescription, the face-to-face meeting is going to be a requirement. Where do we see that? For instance, in France, teleconsultation. We also see that in Luxembourg, it happens that it requires that at least once a year there is a face-to-face meeting. There are being discussions as well right now in jurisdictions like Brazil, where now telemedicine is allowed in full. So you can render medical acts in full via telemedicine because of COVID. However, there are starting to be discussions about what do we do afterwards. Same situation in Canada as well. So this chart just shows the example about the different approaches that we see with these legislators concerning telemedicine. But it's not the only area where there are requirements about that. For instance, where the healthcare professional needs to be registered, we know, or licensed. So for instance, we know that there are many jurisdictions that consider that as far as the healthcare professional is licensed / registered in the healthcare professional residence country, that's enough to treat patients. But there are many and this is indeed what the EU directive of 2011 says. However, we do see within the EU itself many jurisdictions that afterwards say, yes, but well, if the patient is in my country, I want as well the healthcare professional to be registered and licensed in my country. And whenever I'm saying in my country, EU, the same happens in Canada. The different provinces is just, sorry to say, it's just, a nightmare and very difficult. Each province has a different approach. So that really creates a problem. As well, whenever we say we can do full telemedicine medical act through remote systems, obviously that allows for diagnostic, for should allow as well for e-prescription, and should allow as well for potential referrals. However, once again back, it might be a country where it is possible that the healthcare professional renders healthcare services through telemedicine, but later on, if the patient is in another jurisdiction and goes to the pharmacy with a prescription to the pharmacy in a country different from where the HCP is located, that prescription might not be acceptable. And speaking about e-prescriptions, and speaking about as well EU, supposedly many years of discussions about having European prescriptions. Where's the European cross-border prescription? Here there is a snapshot, if you want to say a screenshot, of where we were about that just before COVID. So yes, there is a willingness, and for many years there has been a lot of work to try to have the EU prescription, but agreeing on the content, agreeing on the language, agreeing on the systems, etc., seems not to be well tackled, and still there are really a lot of problems to make e-prescription within the EU a reality. So out of the 22 EU countries, as we are seeing beginning of 2019, still e-prescription was just feasible in a couple, 3 countries. So what's the problem? I said, a patient moves from one country to another because of holidays, because of traveling, whatever reason, and then has a prescription because it's a chronic patient, for instance. He has 2 options: or take the medicines with him, or in case forgetting them or for whatever reason, then having the prescription, but if it's from another country, it might be very probable that the pharmacy may put certain doubts and concerns about that. So this patient might need to look for a healthcare professional in the location where the patient is and where the pharmacy is. So still another example that although many efforts, papers and work being done, still the reality is not there. Another example, and let's get outside the EU, Russia. Russia, and by the way, this is an example of what Teladoc does when considering to start rendering healthcare services in whatever jurisdiction. So first of all, we do a first mapping to understand what's the legal framework. So here we have Russia. Russia allows teleconsultation, but not telemedicine. What is to say, I'm coming back to previous slides, you cannot diagnose the patient through a telecommunication channel. That is to say, a video consultation or an exchange of emails or over the phone. That's not feasible. However, and this is something that we have seen across many jurisdictions, and say before, COVID has allowed and opened the mind of many legislators for telemedicine. They have seen because of the virus, they have seen the benefits of being able to support patients remotely. So here, what you will see, it's another example of what do I do? So, and it's an example that to get there, it's difficult, it's costly, creates a lot of uncertainty because of, well, is this really the scenario that is going to stay or is not, etc. And as well, it does not help any company, any healthcare organization, or any company like Teladoc to understand the resources that might be needed. So moving forward and just kind of trying to take a message out of all these different legislations only on telemedicine. We have not spoken about privacy. Privacy is another nightmare. We can tackle it later on. What are we seeing, or which are the messages that and the concerns in behind that make legal landscapes so different? So first of all, there's a concern about identification of the stakeholders. How can a healthcare professional identify a patient remotely? It's just face, voice, etc. There are means to tackle that. Then as well, how can the patient know who is in behind? What's the name of this physician? What's the organization in behind? A third concern, and this is a huge concern, as we all know, privacy and confidentiality. Confidentiality, I would say, is general terms. something that the healthcare professionals have tackled for many years, and they do respect that. It's very essential for them. Privacy, it's another piece. A lot of changes going on, and a lot of first steps to try to harmonize on this area, but even the EU has not been successful about that. We have the new GDPR regulations since 2016, applicable 2018, and it's a regulation, not a directive, because the purpose was to harmonize more. And it is true there has been a second step in harmonizing, but the harmonization has been very limited. Do I have to speak about CNIL in France taking a more limited approach? That later on, for instance, whenever they're speaking about French healthcare data leaving the country, they needed to step a little bit backwards and say, well, okay, we are EU. However, as well, we have all the concerns about recent recent resolutions and decisions, even from regional data privacy authorities like the Bavarian, about how to, if feasible, share healthcare data with the United States. Is that feasible? Is not? Gosh, it's starting to be a nightmare. Another area of concern, it's about humanization of healthcare. So there has been a lot of activities and a lot of discussions about how we can humanize healthcare, because it's a vital area. We all know that. And what's the role of the healthcare professional in this regard? Nurses or doctors or dentists, etc. So it's important for the patient, this piece of humanization. However, there are many concerns that telemedicine is not for humanization, doing a humanization of healthcare. Then technology, quality. There are a lot of doubts about, is the technology enough? The image is gonna be enough? What about 5G connection? What if falls or drops in the middle of diagnostic or in an emergency situation, etc. Then as well, the other area of concern, can really a healthcare professional deliver and make a diagnostic just by video conference or telephone, etc.? And another bucket, what happens in an emergency situation? This quick call saying, look, I'm bleeding, I don't know what to do, I cannot breathe, etc. So these are the main concerns. However, we know the benefits. First of all, patient rights, access, a better access to healthcare services, the option of how to access these healthcare services, when, as well, telemedicine allows accessibility to more specialties, to the best specialists indeed in the world. It speeds up the process, allows you to, whether the patient is being located outside her residence or the physician is located outside, to connect. As well, affordability as well in economic terms. Efficiencies for patient and healthcare professional. Efficiencies in the sense, I just needed something quick. It's just maybe a doubt, maybe something else, but creates efficiency because saves traveling trips, caregivers going with the patient to a healthcare center, etc. As well, it's very important for certain type of diagnostics or for surveillance or monitoring of patients. It's very important. It makes lives easier, more or less, in this regard. And as well, integrity of data. We can have one repository with images, with the different diagnostics, the healthcare records in just one place, And then finally, and this is healthcare R&D, with proper privacy and confidentiality and quality measures, artificial intelligence. I'm not going to repeat and go back here as well. There are the evidence of different studies about what are the benefits of telemedicine. So let's go and address the concerns. So we create kind of 3 buckets of concerns. One is what we call healthcare governance. Another one is what we call healthcare quality and technology, and finally privacy. But just going through all of them, is telemedicine missing a lot of that? Are there already laws about privacy and confidentiality? Are already as well legislation that assure quality of the technology, whether a medical device, but for instance in the EU CE mark? And as well, healthcare governance. We need to trust our healthcare professionals, not only because of their deontological code, that all of them, they have one and they meet it. It's as well in their ADN. They do have the governance. Maybe we just need specific protocols about how to tackle emergency protocols. But we need to respect our healthcare professionals. It's the same case as when you go to a general practitioner, a GP, and then the GP considers that this requires a specialty, they will do a referral, correct? Why not with telemedicine? Why don't we trust our healthcare professionals and we allow them to consider whether telemedicine, for what he or she is seeing or hearing or is suspicious about, they consider whether it needs to go to an inpatient premises or do a face-to-face visit. Let's trust them. They are the person that has the contact with the patient. So, and just finalizing. So, what are our main conclusions and takeovers? So, telemedicine is not new medicine. It's a different way of keeping on rendering healthcare services. It's a new way that opens many doors. E-health technology, and now coming back to the broader concept, it's going to allow telemedicine, but many other activities that are going to help the rendering of healthcare services. So if we say that telemedicine is a way of rendering healthcare services, then telemedicine needs obviously to apply the same rules as for healthcare services and just tackle the pieces that are not really addressed with the current legislation. We do have privacy, and there's a lot there. It's kind of a nightmare for us lawyers and as well for our IT departments. We have already medical protocols. We have already laws about how to render healthcare services. There might be very little pieces that indeed internal protocols of healthcare professionals and healthcare organizations can clarify that and tackle that properly. However, if we want to render a cross-border / global healthcare services, what we need is to what we need from our legislations is to understand and really not have bias in the concerns about telemedicine. They need to understand what telemedicine and e-health allows, and they need to trust the different options that e-health opens. And we need to be able to explain them, because if we want a global e-health world, we need certain harmonization to assure that healthcare services are rendered by people with organizations with minimum qualifications licenses, medical protocols, and this is something difficult as well. And we have seen that with COVID and the different approaches to vaccines even. different countries having different perspective. So, I mean, scientific evidence is there. We need to rely on that, but maybe we can agree on the principles. Confidentiality and technology. These are elements we need to go and push our legislators in a global world with so much benefits that we don't want that just relying on one jurisdiction. We need to tell them we need to harmonize. We have just seen many different limitations to do a global telemedicine landscape. Saying that, what Teladoc does on a regular basis is the principle of, okay, we need to respect the most conservative legislation. Second, if really needed, we go into the country, but obviously it's not the most efficient way. We go to the country, meaning we settle an entity. We start building a healthcare center with local healthcare providers. However, this is not the most efficient way. If we could agree on global standards, for instance, of qualification of doctors, physicians, nurses, that would help a lot. Same with medical devices rule, although there it seems to, still there are differences, but it seems to be more communication across legislators and as well authorities applying legislation. So we need to push for that, and we are doing so. And in the meantime, we try to approach the benefits of e-health as much as possible to our patients, obviously being compliant with the applicable laws. Sorry for this very quick presentation. Sorry a lot because it might have been very quick, but we wanted to give you a snapshot about the difficulties and where we would like to push as Teladoc as a global company with different products, services, e-health solutions in general term. We want to push for a better system, a global one, that approaches patients to physicians, that makes a reality the globalization of this world, so that a patient can rely on going on holidays and, if needed, contacting a doctor in his home country and being able to go to a pharmacy if needed with a prescription being issued in another country. As well, we would like to give patients the freedom to choose and to be able to reach the best specialists. So thank you very much for attending. Open to answer any question via email, any comment, etc. Thanks a lot.